Well, welcome to today's webinar with Dwight Klappich. Dwight's a retired research vice president and fellow in supply chain at Gartner. He's currently principal of DK at Besant. He has decades of insight in supply chain technology, specializing in logistics, warehousing, fulfillment operations, and digital transformation. I've known and followed Dwight for close to a decade, and it's a privilege to get his insights today into the changing world of warehouse execution technology. So welcome, Dwight.
Thanks. Appreciate the time.
All right, so as we dive into this, Dwight, as we close out 2025, what's your read on the state of warehouse operations and what's fundamentally changed in how leaders are managing their workforces and networks?
Well, it's interesting. As you notice, I was at Gartner for 25 years covering warehouse systems, and I would say that, the use of, technology in warehouses is not new. I mean, you look at WMS, goes back nearly 50 years, but if you really look at the focus for most of that time, it's just been on execution. Get the job done, get the boxes in, get the boxes out. And at best, we had some pretty rudimentary reporting capabilities, kind of ex post facto, looking in the rearview mirror. And that's just not good enough today. Warehouses are getting much more complex. Customers have, lots of challenges, cost challenges, labor challenges, and they need more. And so there's a lot more focus we saw, on companies really focusing on better decision support kind of technologies, help them do a better job managing their warehouses. In fact, years ago, I joked we shouldn't have called them warehouse management systems. We just should have called them warehouse execution systems. So there's just an increased focus on, better mechanisms, both to understand how I'm doing now, but also to help me look forward. What should I be doing next? What's the future going to look like? So I think that's the biggest change that we've seen over the last, couple of years. Is just really due to that complexity that they face.
Makes a lot of sense. So you mentioned labor constraints. I know for me, been in the industry now close to 30 years in different aspects of it, and the tight labor market just seems to be one that's changed a lot, but tends to be persistent now. So as you think about labor challenges and how they've reshaped the game, what's your perspective on the best way for companies to deal with these constraints?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. I think the first thing is to your point, it's persistent. I think a lot of people thought, labor issues were going to be transitory. We were going to get over the hump. I don't think that's going to happen. I think, going forward, we're going to continue to have labor challenges. And if you look at the way companies thought about labor, in the past, they just viewed it as a fungible asset. I'll go down to my local Home Depot parking lot, pick up 5 people, bring them in. I could easily get temporary labor if I needed it at the last minute. And those days are gone. I mean, it's not good enough anymore. So I think, the first thing, the way we use labor management systems in the past, and one, they were just for big companies with big warehouses. And I think now it's just about any company can start to benefit from some of those capabilities. But they used it to stack rank their people. Hey, I want to look at my bottom 20%. I'm going to jettison them. That's not good enough anymore because you might not be able to find those people and certainly find them when you need them. So it's how can I use technology to help me manage my people better? How can I get better performance out of my people, not just stack rank them and get rid of the bottom performers? So I think that's a big shift in the way we saw companies using the technology.
Makes a lot of sense. It definitely seems like they've gone from it being an accountability tool to more of an enablement tool. Instead of just getting rid of my underperformers, like you said, it's more, okay, how do I help everybody be successful in this role, providing the coaching, providing the feedback, identifying where there's opportunities where people are good, where they could use additional training. It's definitely become more proactive versus just rip and replace and assuming that I had 5, 10 other people out there that could do the job better. So it's been interesting. I think we saw that initially when Amazon came into the market. They came in with that mindset of I'm just going to burn through people and I've got unlimited people to tap into. But it seemed like 2, 3, 4 years into it, they started realizing, okay, that's not sustainable either. I've gone through most of the workforce and now we need to really just try to get the people successful in those roles.
Yeah, and the power shifted in fact to the employees. We had some clients when I was at Gartner, and one was down in the Atlanta area. And if you ever flown into the Atlanta airport, you fly over a bunch of warehouses. And they said the employees would start at one end of industrial park and they'd be making $2 more an hour by the time they got to the end. And then they would rip and replace and start over again. So the power's really shifted to the employees. So your point about, employee engagement, it's not just about managing the people, but how do I keep the people that I have? So,
It's interesting going back to Amazon. When that first came in, we heard time and time again that the employees would leave, they'd go to Amazon for $2, $3 more an hour. But then our customers would say, 6 months later, those employees were back because quality of life, quality of the work, being treated with respect, et cetera, really was a driver there. And so in the early days, people are chasing money, but eventually they realize that, the work environment's equally important. And so I think it found more of a balance out there than we first saw, at least.
indeed.
So moving on to reactive and proactive operations, you've talked in your research about the shift from reactive to proactive. What separates organizations that are truly proactive from those that are still chasing yesterday's problems?
Yeah, it's a great, question. It's, the way I often looked at it is, the way we've run warehouses was driving in the rearview mirror. What I was looking at was, how did I do yesterday? How did I do last week? It was always kind of, looking at, what I did in the past and trying to infer from that what I needed to do in the future. And again, I think the leading edge companies just realize that's not good. And of course, we're going to continue to measure how I perform, but that's just telling me how I did. Now I need to figure out how I, turn that around and start driving through the front windshield. And it's funny, I had a client a number of years ago, and he was adamant, absolutely adamant, you could not plan in a warehouse. He said it's just too unpredictable for us to do any type of planning. And I was like, that's the problem. I mean, if you're always reacting, because that's all you're left with if you're not doing some planning. Of course, if you're planning, unforeseen events come up, you can react to those more intelligently, more effectively than if you just assume, hey, I can't do anything. So I think I would say we can't say that most companies are there yet today. I would say these are leading edge companies really starting to say we need to be much more proactive. Some of that was we needed the technologies to help us do that. You look at labor forecasting today, I would say 99% of companies, maybe 98, still do it on a spreadsheet and it's real seat of the pants. Let alone what we distinguished in my previous life between planning and forecasting. Planning was, work I needed to get done today or tomorrow where I had my known planning horizon. Forecasting was, hey, how many people am I going to need for a Christmas rush? That type of thing. And, very few companies have it, but now at least we see the technology there that companies can start to be much more proactive. The way they were proactive at all in the past was how good was the warehouse manager. So.
Makes a lot of sense. It's much easier to run an efficient operation if your headcount matches what your workload's going to be than if you're trying to adjust on the fly and right size your resources based on what's coming in. But if you think about forecasting, I know that's something that we've seen over the last few years become much higher priority for customers. We're asked about it a lot more than 5-10 years ago, say. The challenge you run into, obviously, is there's so many variables in there. So whether it's seasonality or order profile or productivity, or I'm bringing in some temps, so how's their productivity going to be different than my permanent workforce? So just a lot of variables in there on that. So getting all that built into your model is where the challenge is.
Yeah.
So you got to look at all those factors. I think, and we'll talk a little bit about machine learning AI as we go along today, but that's one of the areas that I think it's low-hanging fruit to be able to use machine learning to identify what those short-term trends are going to be. I know one of our customers is able to use machine learning to forecast down using our tools to about a 95% accuracy on an hourly basis on a process. And it's a consistent process. So, other companies' results might vary, but those are some pretty powerful tools that can start giving you that visibility and what you're going to need, where your resources are today, how we need to move them around, and then also looking out, a day, 2, 3 days in the future to make sure you're bringing in the right amount of head count. So definitely a shift from reactive to proactive in forecasting.
Well, it's a great point. One of the things that I was saying, I had some colleagues that did supply chain planning software. And I said, we have spent billions of dollars on supply chain planning software over the last, 20 years. And I said, mark my words, there will be a time when a company has all the inventory they need to service their customers' demands. They're not going to have enough labor to get it out the door. But they spent billions of dollars on supply chain planning software, and they're planning labor, if they're doing it at all, in a rudimentary spreadsheet. Now, I'm not saying, everything has to be algorithmic. Like to your point, there's a lot of nuance in forecasting labor, but to do a more robust job, I think is long overdue. So.
Makes sense. So before we leave the whole labor constraint side of things, I know in the past you've talked about the flexibility companies have on how to schedule labor, how to try to tap into workers that may not be your traditional workforce to try to increase that labor availability. Do you have any insights to share with the viewers today on that?
Well, I might actually defer to you because I think in a sense you're probably a little closer to how your customers are using your technologies. So that's one that I'd have to think about a little bit more.
Okay.
So.
Where I was going there was, outside of the traditional 9 to 5, I work here, to starting to look at, customers, employees that might work, stay-at-home mom that has to be home when her kids come home at certain times, just trying to get a little more creative and flexible on how to address this constraint.
Oh, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. Absolutely. I mean, what's interesting is that I'll give you an example. We had a client that a lot of big e-commerce warehouses were built in the middle of cornfields, in the middle of no place, because there's a lot of cheap land. And they were telling me that they'd run out of men to work in their warehouse. I mean, people weren't going to drive an hour and a half to work in a warehouse, and pretty much everybody that could was either working in their warehouse or had some other full-time job. So they're really trying to encourage more women to work in their warehouse, maybe high school kids. And they realized that the classic 7 to 4, 4 to midnight schedules didn't work. So they're really saying we need to be more creative. So, hey, if we want to bring some of the women, maybe the schedule had to go from 9 to 2. And then maybe they'd work some things. So what's interesting, I saw some clients starting to look at some of the scheduling tools that you see. That's very common in retail. That's very common in healthcare, for example. You go into a hospital, they have odd schedules. So I think we're going to see more of that in the future, where that classic rigid, 8-hour day schedule, that'll still be there for many workers, but for some of the temps, hey, I can bring in, 25 high school kids for 4 hours a day to come work in my warehouse. That's going to be a big value to a lot of companies. It's going to really take rethinking, a lot of the way they run their warehouses. So
makes a lot of sense. So as we move on, many operations teams will tell us that they're drowning in reports. So they don't have problems getting the reports, but they still can't get ahead of the issues. Why is visibility alone not enough, and what turns data into action?
Well, I think the interesting thing is as you said, they got lots of reports. I mean, in warehouses, they're not for lack of data. There's lots of data, almost too much data. The challenge that we saw companies having was they were buried in data, but they were really struggling to turn that data into useful information. So they got data in the warehouse system, they got data in their time ascendance system, they might have a fleet management system, they got all these data, it's an ERP system sitting in all sorts of different systems, is trying to figure out, one, how to get that data, how to pull that data from those different systems, how to concatenate it, because how do I take the data from the time and attendance system and the WMS and put that data together so I get useful information out of it? That was a real struggle. But then the problem is that data was in all sorts of different formats, and it was a real struggle for them. So we would have pockets where they could do certain things. Maybe I have an LMS that I could use, and I can get some of that. But, that was what they were really struggling with is, how to get that into, we talk about the notion of a unified data model or a common data repository, data mart, we keep changing the name, but I mean, the same concepts. And that's what a lot of companies have really struggled. We saw a lot of companies in my past life try to build these systems on their own. And I would say that I can't think of one that succeeded, but I can think of many that failed. And it was how do we get that information, all that data in one place so that I can start to leverage, the tools that are there. There's plenty of analytics tools out there if I can get the data. The problem is that I'm not able to effectively utilize those tools because it's all in different formats. It's not normalized. I can't combine it into something useful. So that was the big challenge we saw a lot of our customers struggling with.
Makes sense. So when I think about reports, it's helpful to have a high level metric, but I think the key is really that ability to see in real time, be able to drill down, determine what the root cause is. So my report might say, minus 10%. Okay, well, that's great, but there's a lot of things that could drive that. So being able to drill down and say, okay, that minus 10% is caused by these two factors, and here's how those factors have changed over time, and then dial it down. Okay, it's these 3 supervisors or those 2 employees, but now I know in real time what the root cause is. Now I can start taking action on it versus if you're too high level or it's too delayed. Okay, last month I missed my numbers. I can have a report that tells me that, but how am I going to use that information to drive change? So that real time is critical, and that ability to drill down to really get to that root cause. You start getting those factors in place, now I can really start being proactive, start using that information to drive change.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And the challenge is there's so much latency between previous action and anything because it was a lot of manual effort on the part of a lot of customers because a lot of that was being done, taking data out of reports off their WMS and doing the root cause analysis manually or trying to feed that into a spreadsheet. Now I'm days, if not weeks, and it's the train has already passed. It's long gone, and now they're on to 10 other problems. So that's why I think too much of it has been just seat of the pants, react, use personal heuristics. So this is what I saw the last time. This is the way I'm going to do it. So it's not based on facts. It's based on gut. Now, some really experienced warehouse managers, the gut might be pretty good. Less experienced warehouse manager, I mean, it's probably not.
So today, AI is outside of the scope of our discussion today. But if you think about AI and this ability to drill down, determine that root cause, I like to say there's just nuggets of gold buried in the workflow data out there across a network. There's so much waste, so much information. The challenge is how do you find that? How do you mine that? Get that down to taking action today. And that's really where I think AI is a game changer in helping me not only identify that, but actually mining that for me, stack ranking it, and then based on my persona, delivering it to me. Oh, okay, I need to take action on these 3 things. It's there, but how to find that. So when we're talking about the challenge to going from reports at a high level, drowning in it, down to action, being able to have the tools to get down to that level in real time, what the root cause is. Now I can take action, and then in real time see how those actions are changing. Are they improving things, not improving things? That allows you to really start driving efficiency, driving cost out of the operation.
But just said, regrettably, everything you say, I agree with 1,000%. But the reality is we hadn't spent a lot of time in warehouse technology and focused on the supervisory worker to give them those kind of tools. I think this is, back to where we started off. I think this is where I think a lot of companies really see the next wave of investment because they basically depended on just the personal capabilities of the warehouse management, but we didn't give them the tools they needed to do their job. And so I think we're starting to see those tools emerge, as you say.
Yeah, I think it's not only sophistication, but also just that the bandwidth. Warehouse supervisors running around trying to get product out the door. They're already working very long hours, and now you're asking them to be proactive. So how do you simplify that as much as possible to make it so that they can be proactive within the bandwidth that they have and the capabilities that they have without needing to sit at a computer for 3 hours a day to figure out all those things that they can do based on the data, and making it kind of one real time, but right there, at their fingertips. So Dwight, you had mentioned the unit data model. So single sources of disparate data don't really give you the useful information because they only provide a partial picture. And I know Gartner in the past, when you were there, discussed the importance, but also the difficulty of getting to a unified data model. Why is that so difficult?
Yeah, it seems like it shouldn't be difficult. It was interesting when I started with Gartner, it was 25 years, it was 2000. The big topic du jour at that time was supply chain event management. And a lot of my colleagues used to call me the cynical analyst. I prefer to be skeptical. I predicted back in 2000 that all these vendors at the time, they were creating these cool visibility tools were going to go out of business. I look like a genius. They all went out of business. It was more than skeptical because, hey, they had great ways to render the data if I could figure out how to get the data together. And the failure at that time was twofold. One is that ability to get the data. I think we've got better tools today to help us just at least get access to the data. It's still a challenge for many organizations. But it's once I get that, we realize that it's kind of like I have, I'm talking to, one person in English, someone in Spanish, and someone in Klingon. And I got to figure out now how to translate that and put that into a common syntax. A lot harder than we ever thought it was. Then, even if we can do that, we begin to realize even within the systems, there's data inconsistencies. The most obvious one people think of sometimes is just product descriptions. You go in there and is it 32-ounce liquid Tide? Is it liquid Tide 32 ounces? Is it Tide liquid 32 ounces? Tide 32? I mean, you'll see those even within the same system inconsistencies. And now I'm trying to report on things, and you can just see that's pervasive across these systems. And I think this is where technology, mentioned AI or other technologies, I think are going to be very valuable to help us go through and do that, because people have tried to manually do that, try to bring these 4 or 5 systems together, and it's just proven a lot more difficult than people thought. So where we do is we see, as you said a little while ago, pockets of analytics. Oh, I got some stuff in my, WMS system. I've got some stuff over here in my lift truck fleet management system. I got some stuff in my time and attendance system. But how do I bring that all together so I get one pane of glass so I can see? It's proven to be very, very difficult. There's a lot of people working on this. We had customers big. I can't name any of them because they're pretty well-known companies that spent millions trying to build this on their own. And I know one very famous one just before I left Gartner in June. They basically killed the project after probably 2, 3 years working on this. So it's proven more difficult. And I think this is where we're seeing some of the technology firms really investing a lot of time. I think this is looking, more encouraging going forward, but it continues to be a real challenge for a lot of companies.
Makes sense. I know for one of the challenges of why it's so important is it's employee data, and employees make mistakes. And I learned that early on working with Raymond's, one of our resellers, and we were pulling data from their iWarehouse telematics. And when we mapped that in with the WMS scans, we found out that 30% of the time the employees were logged into the wrong job code on the forklift relative to what they were doing in there. So we had to merge the data together. You had to create that unified data model to be able to make sense of everything, because you just look at it in any disparate single system and the information's not right. If you think about a WMS, the WMS might give you 60% of that employee's time, but what are they doing with the rest of the time? And I think it really drove home for me this importance of the unified data model. A number of years ago, one of our customers was large 3PL, and they'd have an employee that was doing box making, and they're logged into Kronos job code on box making. So at 8 o'clock, they log in. Well, at 10 o'clock, the supervisor came and said, hey, I need you to go pick a rush order. So the employee forgot to log out of the job code on Kronos, grab the scan gun, they're out there on the WMS, they're picking orders for half an hour, and then they're done with that rush order. They go back, they finish the box making, and then at lunch, they log out. Well, we kept getting calls from our customers saying, hey, your data's wrong. And we'd say, why is the data wrong? And they say, well, Kronos says the employee worked for 4 hours on box making from 8 to 12, and we're showing 3.5 hours. But it's because that data was merged together. We know that at 10 to 10:30, even though they're logged into Kronos, they're actually back out doing picking, because the data tells us, and the WMS is obviously the source of truth there. And so it merged that together. And so when you start looking at, multiple WMSs in a facility or across a network, you start throwing in job codes, you start throwing in time clock, robotics, telematics, even pricing information. All that information gives you good insights, but just looking at individually, it's not going to give you that full visibility of what's going on there. So getting all that into the unified data model is critical. And even if you think about AI, start plugging AI into any of those individual sources, it's not going to tell me the full story. But when I can start merging all that together, now I can start using those tools to really mine those nuggets of gold that I talked about. So that's really a critical thing. But to get to that unified data model, going back to your comment on being so difficult, you got to take those different data sources, you got to normalize them, tell them how to work with each other. Then you got to merge them together, and then you can transform them and start making sense out of it. But once you do that, and that's kind of what we call a phase one, once you do that, once you have that in place, now the whole world of insight starts opening up for you. But that is the hardest thing to do, but it's the most critical thing you do. And then from there, you can really start mining those efficiencies.
Well, it's interesting because you and I talked about this a number of years ago, and I'd had a example of I was talking to someone at Kronos a number of years ago, and he was telling a funny story about they were doing a warehouse visit with a client, and he got up in the morning. It was early in the morning, and they were walking the warehouse before it got busy, and they noticed that there's this whole group of people walking across the warehouse, and they're like, "What's this, a parade?" And they asked the warehouse manager what was going on, and they said, "Well, they just clocked in, over there, on our Kronos system, and they're going to the lift trucks." And they're going, "Well, how long does that take?" And they figured out it was 15 minutes. And they were like all worried about, engineered labor standards. And what they figured out is that was 15 minutes, 4 times a day, clock in the morning, clock out at lunch, clock back in after lunch, clock at the end of the day. So there was 1 hour that they had no visibility into those people because, well, they clocked in at this time, but they logged on to their, I think it was a Red Prairie WMS at the time. And so that's one of the problems with that is when the data's in those two systems, but it's always been kind of difficult to get those things together to get that insight. It was very obvious there. And it was like, well, move the lift trucks or move, the time clock, you're going to save an hour a day for no pain whatsoever. But because that data was in two different systems, they didn't really even have, visibility into it.
That reminds me of one of my favorite stories is one of our customers, they started looking at gap times in there. So gap times are times between scans that exceed the amount of time that you would expect. And they found for this one process in this one area, the gap time was just out of control, just huge cost. When they researched it, they found out that what was happening is it was hot, it was the summer, the employees were walking all the way across the warehouse to get to the single water station, fill up their water bottle, and walking all the way back. And so just by putting additional water stations around, one, they more than paid for our whole system, but drove just massive cost out of the operation. But once again, those type of things, you don't necessarily pick up on them until you get the data in place.
Yeah.
All right. So moving on here, when you look across facilities, inefficiency rarely has one cause. How do leading organizations use data to separate people problems from process or design problems?
I mean, it's good news or bad news. The reality is most don't. They don't have the tools to do that. Like I said earlier, the percentage of all the companies running WMS, what percentage are running labor management? Pretty small percentage. So at best, they're getting whatever comes out of their WMS. And I think that'll give you some of the people side. Doesn't necessarily give the process side. You might be able to infer it through some of the data, but it doesn't directly do that. I mean, this is where people still depend on industrial engineers. They might see that they have a problem, but someone has to go out, walk the floor, see what's going on. I mean, not necessarily a complete, engineer time study, but to really observe what the process is, and that's a big gap for people. So it's a very manual process. Again, a lot of latency in that, between having an issue and when someone can actually diagnose it and fix it. So I think that's a big gap for, I would say, the vast majority of companies at this point in time. So they get some of the labor side. This is a place where I think manufacturing, again, is decades ahead of warehousing. They've been doing tools. They've been big users of simulation, for example, in manufacturing for, 30, 40 years. They have systems in there that, kind of better job of actually talking about what the process looks like so they can diagnose these things better. I think this is a big opportunity for warehousing right now.
Makes a lot of sense. If you think about our background, Easy Metrics was developed in a former company that I co-founded, and we used to run distribution centers. And we were a 4PL, so we did it on a fixed cost basis. So we had to figure out how to drive cost and efficiency out of those operations. And obviously, employee productivity is a big part of that. But the flip side of that is, process efficiency, utilization, just waste in there, et cetera. So when we developed the software to run our operations, and this was late 2009-ish, we realized, okay, the software is really where the value is. So when we spun off the software, became a software company, sold off the outsourcing business. So as we moved into the labor management space, we looked at traditional labor management that is very focused on the employee side, employee productivity, but it seemed like they were just ignoring the whole cost to serve side and the importance and value that brought to it. That as operators, that was critical to us. So as you look at what happens when companies start combining that focus on productivity with those additional cost metrics, how does that change the decision making for them?
So I think the challenge for most company, I use jokingly to say money speaks, right? You look at you take a situation where you might have something that you think is a problem, getting a lot of incidents on it. When you look at it financially, that's not that big of an issue to me. I might have something else that doesn't look as big but has a huger impact on me. But again, very few companies have that ability to monetize what they're doing inside the warehouse. They can see, I picked this many boxes. I can get a, throughput metric, and that's nice. But, I might have one process, that, gosh, I mean, the way, just because of the steps I have to do or what I have to do, it's a much more complicated. And when I look at it, it's costing me a lot more to do that process than something else. But I have no mechanism to really look at the costs on that. So I think it's a big gap for people. And we certainly saw this is something big interest from 3PLs. Because let's be honest, 3PLs, that's their business, right? They make money selling, logistics services, whether that's warehousing or transportation. So if they can, be more financially sound, they make more profit. If they're not, they could lose money because they don't run on big margins. So if I could get from 1.5 to a 2% or a 2.5 or 3% margin, that's a huge impact on my business. But we actually started to see brand owner companies also very interested in this because, again, hey, tell me, from a business effect, which financial is a great way to look at the business effect of something. How am I doing? Are there places that, hey, that's not that big of an issue. Don't worry about that. We don't have enough time there, but we can focus our efforts where we have, bigger impact on the business. And so I think it's something I think a lot of companies are becoming much more interested in versus, hey, okay, I did 50 boxes today. Okay, that's nice to know, but that's not really telling me much. The problem I think with the brand owners is they saw, warehousing in particular is just a cost of doing business. So again, they're very focused on could I lower the cost? So again, if I have some financial metrics will help me with that. But I think the really smart companies are going to see that as more than just, lower my cost by, 2%. Let me see if I can be more effective and focus where it's going to have the biggest bang for the buck.
It's almost like the difference between top down or bottom up. Bottom up, I'm going to get my multi-metric labor standard in place. I'm going to build the standards. I'm going to measure my employees on a productivity level. And that's great and very powerful tool. Top down is where I'm looking across my network, what's working, what's not working, what's profitable, what's not profitable, where are my costs within line where they should be. And then from there, drilling down, and obviously getting down in employee productivity is going to be a key part of that. It's a big part of my costs, et cetera. But what we've seen is employee productivity might be 50% of the employee savings. The other 50% is going to come from getting your missing time under control, getting your indirect, your utilization optimized, getting rid of the waste out there, getting employees working full-time on value-added processes, and then getting to work as efficiently as possible there. But then you've also got the process optimization side. It's great that my employees are working hard, but if they're driving all over the warehouse in very inefficient processes, my cost is going to be higher, even though it's not a productivity issue. So really understanding optimal processes and getting that dialed in. If you're a 3PL, making sure my pricing is in alignment with the work that we're doing, the order profiles we're doing. Are we making money? If we're not, and it's not a productivity or efficiency, maybe my pricing is not aligned with the order profiles that I get, all the way down to you start getting into quality or overtime, et cetera. So there's so much that's needed to drive profitability across the network, and labor productivity is a key part of it, but it's just a part of it. But the workflow data that you capture and get into that unified data model, it still gives you visibility across the board on all those things.
Well, you mentioned something that we hadn't talked about before that I think is really important here. You said network. What's interesting, and I used to argue with some of the old school labor management. I'd say you really needed to be in a warehouse of over 100 people to really justify the time, effort, and cost to go to engineered labor standards, right? And in reality, it's probably even more than that. They would always argue that I was overstating. They might say it was 50 people, but I said what we started to see was companies that might not have 100 people in one warehouse, might have 250 people across 5 warehouses. But they had no clue. And I think I told you this story a number of years ago. We were talking to a client, and they were trying to put in a standardized analytics program across all of their warehouses. And they'd had this warehouse in Argentina that was just killing the metrics, and everybody's this makes no sense. Nobody believed that Argentina was really doing this. But they were consistently reporting. So they finally got in and they were digging under the surface of some of these metrics. And just they found out that nobody did anything wrong, but they were calculating this one key metric different than everybody else. And it wasn't until they really looked across the network that they said, wait a second, we're going to standardize on how we looked at this. And then that provided information to the head of logistics to manage his business across the network. And one of the problems is that the way we've delivered technology from warehousing has been very vertical. Each warehouse management implementation, even if I have the same WMS product, I implement warehouse by warehouse. So if I have 10 warehouses, I have 10 basically instances of that, and their reporting's not looking network wide. So I can get, in many cases, some pretty good analytics at a warehouse level. What I can't get is anything horizontally. And I think that's where it's becoming, I think, much more beneficial to some companies to say, wait a second, I've got this warehouse, network of 10 warehouses. How am I looking across warehouses? And you and I talked about this. I'll probably get the story wrong. Is like there was something like you had someone in San Francisco that you would have thought would be your most expensive warehouse, and someone in Atlanta, Georgia that would have been your cheapest, but the numbers were reversed. And the question was, well, why? I mean, is dig into the numbers. Well, geez, yeah, labor is more expensive in San Francisco, but they're really efficient. Their processes are really nailed. Or over here, my process, I got more waste time. Well, most companies didn't have that ability. So I think, starting to look at this network wide, and then what it's done is I don't need 100 people in every warehouse. I can really start to benefit from that if I'm not looking at it, say before I looked at it as well, I'm going to make this investment to get rid of 10 people. Well, now, I mean, it's maybe it's the value's not in getting rid of just 10 people, or maybe I do across all 10 warehouses, but it's really I can run those warehouses more effectively, see where I'm strong, where I'm weak, focus my efforts a little bit more.
Makes a lot of sense. We have what we call operations financial management, which is a lighter version of labor management. Doesn't get into necessarily the multi-metric labor standards, the performance coaching, the pay for performance, et cetera. But it's looking at that financial performance across your network. It's looking at the waste. It's looking at the process efficiencies. If you're 3PL, looking at the pricing, profit, et cetera. And even though you're not necessarily using that to drive employee productivity, you're still using that to identify where that waste is. So if I have a facility with 8 employees, I'm not going to roll out full labor management. It doesn't make any sense. But I absolutely want to know, how are they performing? What's my cost? Where's their opportunity? Where's their waste? The cost is minuscule compared to what you're going to drive out of it. But I want to have that real-time visibility and control of my network. And you go as deep as a site is ready to go. But some sites, you don't want to go to that level, but I still want that visibility. We have other large customers that have said, we're going to roll that out across our whole network quickly, get the visibility across the whole network, get that understanding of what's working, what my cost is, et cetera. And then I'm going to go in and roll out full labor management on top of that, because then they're ready. So different scenarios. But going back to your point, traditional labor management might only make sense for those larger operations. But getting that visibility and control, I absolutely want to have that across my network, regardless of really what the head count is there.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So Dwight, as we're talking about cost to serve, the concept of activity-based costing comes into play. And so, when I look at cost to serve, I might just be doing averages, which that's great. Every customer's costing me on average a dollar a unit, and I'm billing this customer $1.10. That's fantastic. But when we get into the actual activity that it took, I'm going to find some of those customers are actually costing me $2 a unit. Other customers are costing me 50 cents. Once I'm able to match up, that level of detail with the actual activity that it took to service that customer, it starts really changing the game as far as where I can drive waste and profitability up in the system. So, it has incredible potential, but I know I've heard Gartner talk in the past about activity-based costing tends to have a bad reputation. So what's your insight into that and how it can apply within the industry?
Yeah, great point. I mean, is activity-based costing is not new, came out in the 1980s. And we have a lot of customers are very interested in that. The challenges was basically managing it. It took a lot of time, effort, and cost to really be effective at, activity-based costing. And that was very hard. Systems weren't, built really well to handle some of that. So a lot of companies started off with a great idea. I mean, there's companies in the financial market. I think someone called Acorn was an example, if I remember correctly, where I could do it. Again, this comes back to getting the data and using some of that. But I think you're absolutely right that, I mean, I think a lot of companies would like to, for many reasons, is be able to get down to that level. Now, WMS is, built properly. If they could, they are capturing data at a granular enough level that we could start to do that. But most of the WMS systems weren't doing anything other, they were doing, hey, I did these 5 steps and finally completing this order, for a customer, but I wasn't able to do much with it. So I think the technology's there. If we can figure out how to do that, goes back to our comments about the unified data model. Because particularly, I think is, again, we see some of the 3PLs pushing this again, because, they might have done a contract with somebody and they're losing their shirt because of the way they built their contract. And now in many of the WMSs have pretty advanced 3PL billing capabilities where they're billing at the level, but they have no way to manage their business at that level. They just know, wait a second, here's what I could bill the customer. What's it actually costing me to do that? So I think that's the, the other half of the loaf is if I can figure out I can do with costs, then I know my profitability, right? Because I have a contract, the billing engine is here's my contract. I get, paid for this number of pallet positions. I get paid for this. I get paid for that. But to your point is if I built out what I get paid for that off of $2 a transaction or whatever, and it's costing me four, I'm losing my shirt. And that's probably a bad example, but I think that's why I think you'll see the 3PLs drive this. But then I think, for the brand owner companies, it's still as valuable again to know that wait a second, it's like is this operation here is why is it costing them twice as much money as somebody else to do the same job? There might be very legitimate reasons. Well, maybe labor is more expensive there, or maybe their processes we could, if this place over here can do it, why can't you do it? I can learn from that. And again, it helps me manage my business. But today, they might have gotten the exact same number of boxes out today. That doesn't tell me anything, right? So I think that's why. So I think the challenge was in the past, it was just too difficult for people to do it. But now the technology is getting to the point where, it's not going to cost me an arm and a leg to implement and maintain it. Because that was the other problem with ABC. I might actually implement it, but it's just like labor management. I used to tell customers, if you want to do engineered labor standards, it's a marriage. It's not a project. If you're going into this thinking when you're done with this project, you're done. No, forget it. It's a particular if you do and pay to play. It's activity. Incentive pay. I said the guy in the lift trucks are going to know what he deserves to get paid, and if you're not accurate, you're in trouble. So you have to be ready to invest the time to do it long term. And I think the technology is also going to help, with some of that. So it's not going to be such a burden to maintain it.
So in our system, one of the things that we can do is calculate the rate card, calculate the revenue side of it, match it up with the labor side of it, the cost side of it, et cetera. And just like we talked about before on some of those metrics, having that in real time and that ability to drill down to determine that root cause and get back on track is just critical in here. And so as I think about some examples, we had a 3PL customer that looked and said, okay, I know I'm losing money at this location. And I know I'm losing money on this customer at that location, but I don't know why. And so when you drill down in our system, you're able to identify, okay, we're losing money on the inbound billing trigger. And it's not because of productivity. It's not because of missing time. It's because of the QA process that we put in place there because the customer was complaining about this. And now if you look at how those costs have gone up, we're losing our shirt on that process, which now ripples through to losing money at the whole facility as a whole. Now I have that information. Another example, back in our days when we ran operations, Target was one of our customers. Somebody came up with this idea of we're going to change the order profile coming in on the containers, and it just destroyed the labor efficiency there. But we had the metrics. We were able to go back to them and say, hey, we need to increase your price. Here's why we need to increase your price. We bid it based on X. You've turned it into Y. And here's what it's done to the labor component. And we were able to get that change, to get that operation back to be profitable again. The last kind of example I was thinking about as you were talking, going back to the unified data model. We have a customer that was looking at it and tracking a lot of this in spreadsheets and trying to pull that in. And so they had a pay for performance. So they pulled that in. Yep, we got that. They were doing some cost to serve over here. Yep, we got that. But they weren't taking the bonuses of the pay for performance tied into the cost to serve calculations on their profitability. Disparate data sets. Once again, pulling all that together, now it starts giving you insights that you didn't have before. So all those things are critical. Last comment on kind of that profit management side. You talked about, I think it was one of the brand owners in Argentina where you're talking about that. Being able to take that same concept and using it to come up with a targeted cost to serve. Okay, maybe I'm not a 3PL. I don't actually have revenue, but I can still use those same concepts to say, how much should this site be using based on all the different work and order profiles and volume? how much should they be using and how much are they actually using? And what you'll find, like in your situation, that would identify that no, that Argentina site isn't actually running better, even though whatever KPI they were tracking made it look that way. And we had another customer similar situation where one of their operations looked like these guys are just poorly managing their operation. Their throughput metric went through the floor, but when we dove into the details, we found out that, well, they're actually running really, really well. It's just they went from one big customer to a bunch of small customers that replaced it. Now they're doing twice as much work to get that product out the door. So having that level of visibility in real time to drill down gives you that control that you need. So we got about 10 minutes left, Dwight. So one of the biggest challenges isn't just technology, it's getting teams to trust and use the data. So what are some ways you've seen organizations successfully drive that change management and adoption?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think if you look at warehousing in the WMS space in particular, I think we've actually been pretty good at what we call training. Here's what you do. You click this, you do that. I mean, this is how you do a pick. This is how you do a put away. We're pretty good at that. But what we found consistently was people weren't very good at education. Now, how we would distinguish training versus education. The training was the how. How do I do my job? Okay, you're going to scan this, you're going to do that, the steps in the process, and they were pretty good at that. The education was often the why. What's going on behind the scenes. We didn't do much of that. And I'll give you an example. So, years ago, we saw a lot of people that, originally, they would be counting, they pick piece pick, right? So I have to go someplace and pick 5 cases. So the way the technology was, I'd scan one box and I'd enter 5, and I'd pick that. Well, a lot of companies found out they're having some issues, so they want to go to active scanning. I want you to scan all 5 boxes. And productivity went through the floor, right? Because they had all sorts of issues there. And a lot of frustration on the part of the users, and it really hurt the project. And so one of the things that they had put the project on hold, they went back and they wanted to explain to the users. So they set up this lunch and learn where they brought people in as this is why we are doing this. And they told the employees, we know your productivity is going to go down, but we hope as you get more experience, you'll get better at it. But this is why we're doing it, because we're finding situations where you pick 4 of the right thing and 1 of the wrong. The classic, if you ever, you're old enough to, as I am, in the grocery store, it used to be if you bought 10 cans of Campbell's soup, they'd do the same thing. They'd scan 1 can of soup and enter 10. Well, they didn't know is that, 10 cans of tomato soup or 1 can of tomato and, whatever. So they went to active scanning. And you'd stand there while they had to scan every can of soup. Well, that's because they didn't know from an inventory planning standpoint, hey, did I just sell 10 cans of tomato soup or 1 can, And so same thing. Well, that was one example. We had another company, the same problem. They were receiving tires. And so productivity, same kind of thing. They had to scan every tire coming off, where before they just unloaded the tires. But the problem, they were shipping orders out where they ordered 4 of the same tire. They got 3 of one and 1 of something else, and they had to do the return. So this education, I think, is really important here. Is like, why are we doing this? What's this mean? How to benefit from what you're doing, not just the steps that you go through. And when we've seen people do that, we've seen projects become much more successful. These tend to be small. Like I said, we've seen a lot of companies do lunch and learns where they bring people in, to help them on stuff like that. Because again, this is change management, is getting people to change. The other thing we saw this help is every project has what I used to call the why nots. The people on a project that can tell you why it's not going to work. There's always somebody that my sister used to call them gray clouds, but the why nots. By doing this and explaining to be, hey, this is why we're doing it, what it means, and what it means to the business and the value. Okay, you probably still have that why not. You're just not going to get rid of them. Most of the other people are going to say, Charlie, shut up. We understand, you're negative, and it really helps you get over that hump. And then I think just some of the other stuff is just basic change management. But I think here is it's going to be educating people on how their job is going to change, not how to use the system. Okay, this is how you're going to manage. How we even said this. I was talking to some of my planning systems colleagues. I was asking them how many companies have a unified decision-making methodology. You know, if they taught their people how to make decisions. And I was surprised how few companies have actually done that. But the companies that outperform often have. Hey, this is, you know, you hear a term like an S&OP process. Well, let's teach you the Dwight Klappich S&OP process, and we're going to educate you on how that works. Oh, then when I introduce the technology, it's much easier from a change management standpoint. I think it's going to be the same thing here is, you know, how do I as a warehouse manager start managing towards profitability versus expediting? Because to be frank, most warehouse managers, that's what they've been in the past as expediters. Go solve a problem. You know, what was the next problem that I had to deal with versus going back to our whole concept here is proactively managing to become a more profitable organization. That's going to take re-education.
So you had mentioned before about pay for performance and incentives. And so when I think about change management, user adoption, that's something I've just seen time and time again really changes the game in getting the associates to embrace the tools to use the system and drive productivity up, drive waste out of the system. And going back to our background when we ran operations, we became #1 in the Walmart network for 3 years in a row, and pay for performance was an absolutely critical component of that. And I remember one of the customers saying, "There's no elbows on boxes here. You know, everybody's very focused. They knew what the goal was. They knew how they were going to be rewarded. They got the change that or the incentives to share in the savings." And so, from a change management and adoption standpoint, once you educated them on that, it really change the dynamic in there. And then going back to your comment from a supervisor standpoint, their role changed significantly from I need to motivate people to try to work harder to now they are that person removing constraints because the employees are coming saying, hey, this is keeping me from being successful. So that supervisor is now getting involved with improving the process versus just trying to motivate people. So it was really powerful in there to drive that. So we just got a few minutes left. I want to hit on this briefly because I know especially the last several years at Gartner, you really focused on the robotics side of things. So how do you see the robotics changing the industry? What are your thoughts as far as recommendations for customers as they look at going down that path?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the issues that I would often ask customers, so yeah, I kind of led Gartner's warehouse automation and robotics coverage. And one of the first things I'd often ask people is, do you have a labor management system? Do you have anything like that? They'd be why? And I said, well, how do you know what to automate or where to automate or whether automation is going to be effective if you don't have the information? Going back to our whole conversation about information. And I said, you know, I think everything we've talked about today, that's going to give you the information to say, here's where automation is going to benefit me the most. Now, some of it they'll understand is, hey, truck unloading is a big issue for me because I can't keep anybody because my warehouse is in Houston and it's 800 degrees in the back of a truck. Okay, they'll know that, but they don't understand what the cost of automating that or the value in automating. I think the labor management, your Ops FM tool, I think will be really valuable for people because one of the biggest challenges people have in looking at automation is putting a business case together. Now, yeah, you can go hire a consultant for $250,000. They'll come in and help you do an evaluation, but that's a point in time. And yeah, they're very good at it, but most of what you're going to pay them for is to get that information they're going to use to then figure out, okay, hey, by introducing locus robotics in this area, you're going to improve your picking performance by 32%, which is going to have this, well, what's it costing me today? From a labor standpoint. So I think, a lot of companies are jumping into the automation, without having the information. I would say for me, I think companies would benefit from having tools like this that are going to really focus them in on where automation can really have the biggest bang for the buck.
Yeah, oftentimes I'm asked, I got 5 projects. How do I prioritize which projects and where labor management or easy metrics falls within there? And going along with what you said, I recommend, obviously I'm biased, but recommend rolling out us first because one, you're going to get a 10-to-1 ROI, pretty straightforward. So it'll help fund those other initiatives. But equally important, like you said, now I have that measuring stick in place. Now I can actually know what my cost is before, what my cost is after. If I do that automation project, it actually changes things, to have a ripple effect anywhere else, et cetera. So it gives you the ROI, plus it gives you that way to measure progress and how those other
Well, I'll give
things are.
you absolutely, and I'm not doing this just to patronize you, to be frank. I mean, I literally used to tell clients this all the time, but we saw if you look at what we used to call heavy payload transport robots. So these would be, an autonomous lift truck. Um, companies would be looking at this. I mean, you could even say for a non-autonomous high reach truck, hey, that's quarter of a million, $300,000 investment. Is it going to pay it back? Is it worth it for me to do something like that? I mean, companies would spend weeks digging into the data to try to figure that out. Now, there's a lot of frustration in people that invest in that technology because they put it in the wrong places. It didn't. We find out in many cases, hey, if you're not operating, two shifts a day, have, long distance, if I'm not, you got a quarter of a million square foot warehouse that has the distance, well, your system would help me understand that. And I could say, well, am I going to get the benefit from that if I go for a fully autonomous, lift truck? So that's just one very specific place where having that information really sets you up to make that decision first easier, more quickly, and then I think in the end is more intelligently. And where we've seen people have the data, then it's much easier to actually get the money. When you go to get the capital appropriation, having detailed information that says, look, this is my cost today. We do this. This is how much it's going to truly lower my costs. Because I said today, you're going to go in there without that information, and CFO is probably going to push back on you, going, You're not giving me enough information. So it's another 6-week project. So I think it's really critical. And I'm for automation. I'm certainly not against automation. I just think having the information will really make it a much easier decision. So.
Well, we're at the top of the hour, Dwight. So I want to thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights with everybody. And
Well,
for our
thank you for the
listeners,
opportunity.
yeah, we would love to continue the discussion on how warehouse performance management could help your organization prepare for 2026 and beyond. So thank you, everybody, for your time today. And Dwight, especially thank you for joining us.
Thanks.